Millionaire hires a fake wife to trick his dying grandfather. But the old man had the final twist. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's return to our main character. The rain came down in silver sheets over Manhattan, streaking against the glass of skyscrapers and filling the gutters with rushing water. Inside a penthouse high above the storm, Alexander Hayes, 32 years old, heir to the Hayes fortune, sat at a marble desk that looked more like a judge's bench than a workspace. His jaw was tight, his eyes locked on the thick envelope in front of him. The envelope carried a single sheet of paper, his grandfather's latest medical report. Words like advanced stage and limited time bled into him, heavier than the storm outside. His grandfather, patriarch of the Hayes Empire, had issued his final demand. Before I die, I want to see you married. No wife, no inheritance. Alexander leaned back in his leather chair, running a hand through his dark hair. Marriage. Love. Domestic bliss. Words that belonged in another man's world. His was a world of mergers and contracts, billion-dollar deals that lived and died on ink and signatures. Yet here he was, cornered not by a board of directors, but by one old man's dying wish. His phone buzzed. A message from his grandfather's lawyer. He's serious this time. Without proof of marriage, the will won't hold you as heir. Alexander cursed under his breath. Proof of marriage. He didn't need love. He needed a solution fast. Across town, under the same storm, Clara Evans hurried down the worn steps of her apartment building. The hood of her thin coat clung to her damp hair, her sneakers soaked through. She clutched an envelope close to her chest, the hospital bill for her younger brother, just 17, fighting a condition that demanded treatments she couldn't afford. Clara's paycheck as a trainee nurse covered little more than rent and groceries. And tonight the landlord had slipped a notice under her door. Eviction in 10 days. She bit her lip against the sting in her throat. Keep walking, Clara. Don't cry now. Her reflection flickered in a darkened storefront, tired eyes, hair pulled back in a messy bun, scrubs beneath her coat. A woman holding the world together with tape and prayer. She pressed her palm against the bill, whispering, "I'll find a way, Tommy. I promise." Back in the penthouse, Alexander's phone lit up again this time, with a calendar alert. Dinner with grandfather. Tonight, 7 p.m. He exhaled sharply, slid the medical report into a drawer, and straightened his tie. Whatever decision he made, he had hours to find an answer. The storm outside roared louder, as if mocking him. The Hayes family estate looked like something carved out of old money-stone columns, wrought iron gates, oil paintings that seemed to watch as you passed. Alexander walked into the dining hall, his polished shoes echoing on the marble floor. At the head of the table, his grandfather sat upright, thin and pale but still sharp-eyed, his cane resting against his chair. "You're late," the old man rasped, though the corners of his mouth twitched into something like a smirk. Alexander slipped into the chair across from him. "I came as fast as I could." "You think time waits for you?" His grandfather tapped the cane once, firmly. "Not for me, not anymore. I want to see you settled before I go. The company needs stability. The family needs legacy." Alexander's jaw tightened. "And if I don't? Then you'll watch everything I built pass into other hands. To cousins who barely know the meaning of work. To men who will tear it apart." His eyes, still sharp despite the sickness, locked on Alexander. "Bring me a wife, or lose it all." The room fell into silence except for the storm beating against the high windows. Hours later, Alexander stood under an awning outside a downtown hotel, rain still dripping from the edges of his trench coat. His driver held an umbrella, but Alexander waved him off. His mind was elsewhere on the impossible demand echoing in his ears. That's when Clara stumbled out of the lobby, clutching her soaked bag against her chest. She nearly collided with him, her shoes slipping on the wet pavement. Alexander reached out instinctively, steadying her by the elbow. "Careful," he said, his tone more clipped than kind. "Sorry," she mumbled, blinking rain from her lashes. She looked up then, and for a split second, their eyes met. Hers, wide and guarded. His, sharp and assessing. Two strangers bound by nothing but bad timing and bad weather. She pulled away, muttering an apology before hurrying down the steps. But Alexander didn't move. Something about the encounter held him still, thoughts sparking in his mind. A stranger, unconnected, desperate, if the hospital bill slipping out of her bag was any clue. A plan began to form. The next day, Clara found herself summoned to a law office she had never heard of. A man in an immaculate suit introduced himself simply as Alexander Hayes. His office was all glass and chrome, overlooking the city like a throne above its subjects. She sat stiffly in the leather chair, dripping nerves. "Why am I here?" He didn't waste time. He slid a document across the desk. Pages, neatly bound. "A contract. I want you to marry me," he said flatly. Clara blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "Not for love, not for forever, for appearances." His gaze stayed locked on hers, cool, unyielding. "My grandfather is dying. He wants to see me married. Without it, I lose my inheritance. You'll play the role of my wife until the terms are satisfied." Her lips parted, breath-catching in disbelief. "That's insane. You don't even know me." "I don't need to know you. I need you to follow the rules." He tapped the contract with one long finger. 5 events. No questions about my personal life. No crossing boundaries. 6 months, and then you walk away with enough money to pay every bill you've ever seen. Clara stared at the papers, her pulse thundering in her ears. 6 months. Enough money to save her brother, maybe even enough for a fresh start. Her fingers brushed the pen, then pulled back. She swallowed hard. What kind of woman agreed to sell her last name for survival? She thought of Tommy's pale face in the hospital bed, the eviction notice crumpled in her bag, the empty fridge back home. Her hand trembled as she reached again. The pen slipped slightly between her damp fingers, leaving a faint smudge of ink on the margin. Alexander's eyes followed every move, cold and sharp, as if testing how far desperation could push her. She exhaled shakily, closed her eyes for half a second, then pressed the tip of the pen to paper. She signed. Alexander leaned back, satisfaction flickering in his gaze. "Welcome to the arrangement, Mrs. Hayes." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had just stepped into a world she didn't belong to, a marriage built on lies and necessity. But somewhere deep inside, a whisper warned her this was not going to end the way either of them expected. And outside, the storm rolled on. The rain had stopped by morning, but the city still wore last night's storm like a bruise. Clara sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the stack of papers she'd tucked into her backpack, the contract that now bound her to a man she had met barely 24 hours ago. Her apartment smelled faintly of mildew and burnt toast from the neighbor's kitchen. The wallpaper peeled at the corners. The radiator clanked without giving off heat. She looked around and knew, with a sharp ache in her chest, that this life, this room was slipping away. Her phone buzzed. A message from her landlord. Rent due today. No more extensions. She closed her eyes, inhaled, and whispered, "I signed it for you, Tommy. Don't let it be for nothing." On the nightstand sat a photo of her brother, smiling weakly in a hospital gown, holding up 2 fingers in a peace sign. His fight wasn't fair, but she would fight it for him. If playing the fake wife of a cold, arrogant millionaire bought him another chance, then she would play her role. At the same moment, Alexander Hayes was stepping out of his penthouse suite. His tie knotted perfectly, his suit pressed without a wrinkle. The world knew him as ruthless, decisive, the man who never flinched in the face of billion-dollar deals. But this morning, a different kind of tension hummed beneath his skin. He had done it. He had secured the solution, Clara Evans, a woman desperate enough to accept his terms, ordinary enough to pass as believable, and malleable enough to be molded into whatever shape the Hayes family demanded. He glanced once at the silver watch on his wrist, then slid into the back seat of his black Bentley. "Pick her up," he told his driver. "We're going to the estate." Clara waited outside her crumbling apartment building, her backpack slung over one shoulder. When the Bentley pulled up, sleek and black like a panther, it felt like the wrong movie playing against her backdrop of cracked sidewalks and graffiti-stained walls. The driver stepped out, holding the door. Clara hesitated, fingers curling around the strap of her bag. Neighbors peeked from windows. A kid on a rusted bike slowed to stare. She ducked her head and slid into the car, the leather seat swallowing her in unfamiliar luxury. Alexander sat across from her, scrolling through his phone, expression unreadable. He didn't glance up until the car merged into traffic. "You look tired," he said matter-of-factly, as if noting the weather. Clara bristled. "I worked a night shift before you summoned me. Sorry I don't look like a magazine cover." His eyes flicked over her, assessing. "That's about to change. You can't walk into my grandfather's house looking like you just rolled off a 12-hour shift." She bit her lip, stung, but stayed silent. He wasn't wrong. The fraying hem of her coat, the scuffed sneakers, the faint smell of antiseptic from the hospital, none of it belonged in his world. The car stopped in front of a boutique tucked between glass towers. Inside, racks of gowns shimmered under soft lighting. Clara hesitated at the entrance, but Alexander didn't wait. He strode in, his presence commanding the attention of every stylist in the room. "This is Clara," he said, his tone clipped. "She needs a wardrobe, appropriate for dinners, galas, family gatherings, tonight included." The head stylist's eyes widened slightly, then softened into professional warmth. "Of course, Mr. Hayes." Clara was whisked away into a whirl of fabric and mirrors. Dresses slid over her shoulders, silk, satin, sequins, each one more expensive than her entire apartment. She stood stiffly as assistants pinned hems and adjusted straps, her reflection morphing into someone she barely recognized. When she stepped out in a simple but elegant navy gown, Alexander finally looked up from his phone. His gaze lingered a second too long before he cleared his throat. "That one! Buy it!" And everything else she tried. Clara's cheeks warmed. She wanted to protest, wanted to say she didn't need a closet worth more than her life savings, but the words caught in her throat. This wasn't about her comfort. This was about survival. By late afternoon, the Bentley rolled through the iron gates of the Hayes estate. The mansion rose ahead like something from another century, its stone facade gleaming under the pale sun. The driveway curved through manicured gardens, fountains spilling crystal water into marble basins. Clara pressed her forehead lightly against the glass, watching the world she was about to step into. "This doesn't feel real," she whispered. Alexander glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "It's real, and if you want to survive in it, you'd better start acting like it." The car stopped. A butler opened the door, bowing slightly. Clara stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath her new heels. She felt the weight of a dozen eyes staff lined up in neat rows, curious, judging. Alexander placed a hand lightly at her back, guiding her forward. To anyone watching, they might look like a couple arriving home together. To Clara, it felt like stepping onto a stage where every mistake would cost her more than she could afford. Dinner was served in a dining hall large enough to echo. The table stretched farther than her apartment building was wide, polished to a shine that reflected the chandelier's light. Clara sat beside Alexander, her hands resting nervously on her lap as servants glided silently, placing silver-domed dishes in front of them. At the head of the table, his grandfather sat, his frail frame wrapped in a tailored suit, his eyes sharp as ever. "So," the old man said, his voice carrying easily across the cavernous room, "you finally brought her." Clara's heart jolted. Her. Alexander's voice was calm, smooth. "Grandfather, this is my wife, Clara." The word wife rang in her ears like a bell struck too hard. She forced a polite smile, folding her hands tighter. "It's an honor to meet you, sir." His grandfather's eyes scanned her, from the carefully styled hair, to the borrowed gown, to the hands that trembled slightly, despite her effort to still them. Something flickered in his gaze: approval, perhaps, or suspicion. "Tell me, Clara," he said, leaning forward slightly, "do you love my grandson?" The question hit her like ice water. She opened her mouth, panic tightening her throat. But before she could stammer an answer, Alexander's hand slid over hers beneath the table. His grip was firm, steady, commanding her silence. "She wouldn't be here if she didn't," Alexander answered smoothly, his eyes locked on his grandfather's. The old man chuckled, a sound halfway between amusement and skepticism. "We'll see." After dinner, Clara wandered alone through the estate's endless halls. The walls bore portraits of stern men and elegant women, each framed in gold, each staring down at her like a jury. She paused before one painting a woman with kind eyes, pearls at her throat. "That was my grandmother," a voice said behind her. She turned. Alexander stood in the doorway, tie loosened, glass of whiskey in hand. "She looks gentle," Clara said softly. She was, Alexander replied, his tone quieter than before. The only one who ever told my grandfather no and lived to laugh about it. Clara studied his profile, the shadows carving sharp lines into his face. For the first time, she saw not the arrogant CEO, but a man carrying a weight no contract could define. "Why me?" she asked suddenly. "Out of everyone you could have chosen, why me?" He took a slow sip, eyes unreadable. "Because you look desperate enough to say yes." The words cut, sharper than he intended. Clara turned away, swallowing the sting. "Then I hope desperation makes me convincing." Alexander's gaze lingered on her back, something unspoken pressing against his ribs. He set the glass down harder than necessary, breaking the moment. "Get some rest. Tomorrow the real performance begins." Clara nodded, her hands clenched at her sides, and walked down the hall. She had entered this world for survival, but she could already feel its walls pressing in, testing whether she would bend or break. The next morning broke clear, the storm washed out of the sky, but Clara felt the weight of it still pressing on her chest. She woke in a room larger than her entire apartment, high ceilings, velvet curtains, a king-sized bed that felt too empty. She lay there for a long moment, staring at the ornate molding above her head, trying to remind herself this was real. She had agreed to it. She was now by paper and pretense Mrs. Hayes. A knock rattled the heavy door. Before she could answer, a maid stepped in, her uniform crisp, her eyes averted. "Mr. Hayes asks that you join him in the study." Clara sat up quickly, smoothing her borrowed nightgown. "Now?" "Yes, ma'am." The title "ma'am" sounded foreign on her ears. She nodded, swallowed the knot in her throat, and followed the maid through the sprawling corridors. Oil paintings glared down at her. Chandeliers glinted like judgment. Every step echoed, reminding her she did not belong. Alexander was already in the study, standing near a mahogany desk piled with folders. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching the edge of his jaw, his eyes as cold as the glass towers he ruled. "Sit," he said simply. Clara obeyed, sinking into the leather chair opposite him. The desk between them looked less like furniture and more like a barricade. He slid a thin folder across the surface. "These are the terms. You'll follow them exactly." Her fingers hovered over the folder. "Terms?" He leaned back, steepling his hands. "Rules. Conditions. Call them what you want. But if you want this arrangement to hold, you'll memorize them." She opened the folder, scanning the neat list typed in bold. Rule 1. This marriage is for appearances only. No genuine affection is required or expected. Rule 2. You will attend 5 major events with me as my wife. You will dress, speak, and behave accordingly. Rule 3. No questions about my personal life or business dealings. Rule 4. Maintain confidentiality. Nothing leaves this house, not to friends, not to family. Rule 5. After 6 months, the contract ends. You walk away. Her stomach twisted. Each line felt like a lock clicking shut around her. "Why write it down?" she asked quietly. "Afraid I'll forget?" His lips curled faintly, not quite a smile. "Afraid you'll imagine this is something it's not." She pressed her thumb to the edge of the paper, feeling the sharpness bite into her skin. "And what if I break one of these rules?" Alexander's eyes narrowed. "Don't." The single word cracked like a whip. Clara dropped her gaze back to the list, biting down on her retort. He tapped the final page with a pen. "Sign." Her throat went dry. She thought of her brother in that hospital bed, his face pale beneath harsh fluorescent light. She thought of the eviction notice, the empty fridge. She picked up the pen, her hand trembling again. The black ink flowed smoothly as her name curved across the page. Clara Evans Hayes. Her stomach knotted at the sight of it. Alexander collected the folder, tucking it neatly into a locked drawer. "Good. Now let's get you ready." The next hours blurred. Clara was escorted into a private wing of the mansion where racks of designer clothes lined the walls. Stylists buzzed around her, measuring, pinning, fussing. A makeup artist tilted her chin, brushing foundation over the shadows beneath her eyes. A hairdresser tugged pins through her messy bun, sculpting it into soft waves. Clara sat rigid through it all, staring at her reflection as layer by layer of her old self disappeared. The tired nurse in worn scrubs faded. In her place, a woman in silk and diamonds emerged. Someone who could pass at Alexander Hayes's side without raising suspicion. When they finished, she hardly recognized the woman in the mirror. Her lips were painted a deep rose. Her skin glowed. Her hair framed her face in perfect waves. The gown shimmered midnight blue, hugging her form in ways that made her want to cross her arms. The head stylist clapped her hands. "Perfect. Mr. Hayes will be pleased." Clara swallowed hard. She didn't want him pleased. She wanted to go home, but home was gone. Alexander appeared in the doorway, adjusting his cufflinks. His gaze swept over her, pausing for the briefest moment. Something flickered there, approval, maybe, or curiosity before his mask returned. "That will do," he said. Clara's spine stiffened. "You mean I'll do?" His brow arched. Semantics. She lifted her chin, trying to mask the heat on her cheeks. "I'm not your puppet." "No," he agreed coolly. "You're my wife. At least for now. And my wife will know how to walk into a room without looking like she stumbled in from the subway." Her teeth clenched, but she bit back the retort. She couldn't afford to fail before the performance even began. That evening, they practiced. Alexander led her into the grand ballroom of the mansion, empty but for the gleaming parquet floor and towering windows. "Again," he said, his voice sharp. "Smile, but not too wide. Hold my arm. Walk with purpose, not hesitation. Everyone will be watching you." Clara looped her hand through his arm, her steps uneven at first. He corrected her posture, guided her pace, reminded her of names and faces she would encounter. She stumbled once, tripping on her heel. He caught her, his grip steady, his face close enough she could see the flecks of gray in his eyes. For a heartbeat, silence hung between them. Then he stepped back, releasing her. "You'll improve. You have to." She straightened, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I'm not here to impress you, Alexander. I'm here to save my brother." His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Later, alone in her room, Clara peeled off the gown and wiped away the makeup, revealing the tired nurse beneath once more. She stared at her reflection, at the faint smudge of mascara beneath her eyes, and whispered to herself, 6 months. Just 6 months. But deep down, she knew the truth. This was no ordinary contract, and the rules she had just signed might not be enough to protect her heart. The following days moved like a blur, a montage of transformation Clara could hardly believe she was living through. Morning after morning, she woke in the mansion's east wing and was ushered into a routine that felt more like a boot camp than a fairy tale. Etiquette coaches drilled her on how to sit, how to hold a glass, how to navigate conversation without giving away the fact that she had once spent nights studying under fluorescent lights in a nursing school library. "Don't grip the fork like you're about to stab someone," one instructor scolded, nudging her hand into position. Another corrected her posture. "Shoulders back, chin high, you're not a guest anymore, you're Mrs. Hayes." She practiced smiles in the mirror until her cheeks ached. She walked hallways in heels until blisters formed at the back of her feet. She stumbled, she grumbled, she rolled her eyes behind closed doors, but little by little, she began to hold herself with a kind of practiced grace. Alexander watched it all with the dispassion of a CEO overseeing a merger. Sometimes he corrected her with sharp words, other times with a raised brow that said not good enough. Once, when she mispronounced the name of a foreign investor she would soon meet, his voice cut like glass. "If you embarrass me in front of him, it won't just be your pride you lose." Clara clenched her fists, wanting to snap back, but she bit her tongue. She reminded herself. 6 months. Just 6 months. Still, in quieter moments when he thought she wasn't looking, she caught something else in his gaze. Curiosity. A flicker of admiration when she recovered quickly, or when her humor slipped out in spite of herself. The test came sooner than expected. A family gathering. Not just dinner with his grandfather this time, but the entire Hayes clan, cousins, uncles, aunts, business partners who might as well have been blood. The mansion's grand hall glittered with chandeliers. The long table laid with china, so fine she was afraid to touch it. Clara stood at the top of the sweeping staircase, her hand resting on Alexander's arm. The navy gown had been replaced by emerald silk tonight, a diamond pendant at her throat. She felt like a fraud in every thread. But when Alexander leaned down and murmured, "Smile," she obeyed. The eyes turned upward, dozens of them, as the pair descended. Clara felt each stare like a pinprick against her skin. "Alexander," An older cousin called from across the room, raising his glass. Finally decided to settle down? Laughter rippled, sharp and knowing. Clara forced her lips into a polite curve. Alexander's grip tightened on her hand. "This is Clara," he announced. "My wife." The word landed heavy again. Wife. She stood taller, pretending it belonged to her. Dinner was a minefield. Questions flew from every direction. "So Clara, where did you two meet?" She froze, fork halfway to her mouth. The script Alexander had drilled into her ran through her head. "At a charity event," she said smoothly. "We spoke for hours. I suppose the rest is history." A polite chuckle, a few nods. She exhaled, relieved. Another voice, this time sharper. Charlotte Alexander's cousin, elegant in a crimson dress that seemed to drip disdain. "And what exactly do you do, Clara?" The table quieted. Clara swallowed. "I'm a nurse. Training still, but—" Charlotte's smirk widened. "A nurse? How quaint. I suppose everyone needs a backup plan." The laughter this time was less polite, more cutting. Clara's cheeks burned. She gripped her napkin under the table, her heart thudding. Alexander's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Clara lifted her chin. "Yes," she said clearly, "I am a nurse. It's hard work. It's long hours. But when someone's life is in your hands, you don't get to walk away just because it's inconvenient." The room hushed. Charlotte's smile faltered. Alexander's grandfather chuckled, low and approving. "Spoken like someone who knows the value of work." Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time, the gazes around the table shifted, not all admiration, not yet, but something closer to respect. Later, as guests mingled over dessert, Alexander led her out onto the terrace. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of roses from the gardens. "You handled yourself," he said quietly, leaning against the stone railing. She crossed her arms. "You mean I didn't humiliate you?" His lips quirked, the closest thing to a smile she'd seen. "I mean you held your ground. Most would have folded under Charlotte's tongue." Clara looked out over the sprawling lawn, the lights twinkling in the distance. "I've had tougher critics than Charlotte. Patience in pain can be crueler than any cousin in a silk dress." He studied her for a long moment, then said softly, "You don't belong here." The words stung. She turned toward him, ready to argue. But his gaze was distant, not mocking, almost wistful. "Neither do I," he added. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the night breeze. Inside, Charlotte seethed, whispering to a circle of relatives. "She's not one of us. You all see it. She'll ruin everything. Mark my words." A plan was already taking shape in her sharp eyes. A plan to tear down the stranger who had dared to sit at their table and speak as if she belonged. Clara returned to her room late that night, the diamond pendant cool against her skin, the weight of the evening still pressing down on her shoulders. She peeled off the gown, sank into the enormous bed, and whispered into the dark, "6 months, Clara. You can survive 6 months." But even as she closed her eyes, she couldn't shake the memory of Alexander's voice on the terrace low. "Almost vulnerable. Neither do I." No, it was the first crack in the armor, the first glimpse that beneath the cold exterior, Alexander Hayes was more than the contract that bound them. And that realization, terrifying and tender, was the one thing Clara hadn't prepared for. The next morning, the mansion was unusually quiet. The staff moved about their duties, but the air felt charged, like the pause before a storm. Clara sat at the breakfast table, stirring her coffee though she hadn't taken a sip. Her thoughts replayed the night before the stairs, the laughter, the sharp sting of Charlotte's words. Yet also the moment on the terrace, Alexander's voice low, confessing something she hadn't expected. "Neither do I." It unsettled her, not because it was cruel, but because it wasn't. For the first time, she had glimpsed a man beneath the steel armor, someone carrying weight she couldn't yet name. Alexander walked in, suit jacket slung casually over one shoulder, tie still loose. He looked less polished than usual, which somehow made him more human. "You're awake early," he remarked, pouring himself coffee. "I couldn't sleep," Clara admitted. "Your cousin's voice kept ringing in my ears." He smirked faintly. "Charlotte has that effect. She spent her life convincing herself she's the sharpest in the room. Clara looked down at her hands. She made me feel small. Alexander leaned against the counter, studying her. You didn't stay small. You fought back. That's what mattered. Her eyes flicked up, surprised. You actually noticed? I notice everything, he said smoothly, but softer than usual. He took a sip of coffee, then set the cup down. Tonight there's a gala downtown. Bigger crowd, more press. If you think Charlotte was harsh, wait until you're under cameras. Clara's stomach clenched. And if I fail? His gaze lingered, steady, unreadable. Then we both lose. The day passed in a haze of preparation. Stylists descended again, choosing a crimson gown that shimmered under light, diamonds that sparkled at her ears. Clara endured the tug of hairpins, the swipe of lipstick brushes, the click of heels pressed into her hands. She was being sculpted again, reshaped into Mrs. Hayes, a woman who could stand in the glare of society's spotlight without flinching. But in the mirror, she still saw the nurse beneath. The girl who had once worked double shifts to buy medicine, who had sat awake nights in a cramped apartment, whispering promises to her sick brother. That girl hadn't vanished. She was only hidden beneath silken diamonds. That evening, the gala unfolded in the glass atrium of a downtown hotel, the city lights flickering behind floor-to-ceiling windows. The crowd glittered with wealth men in tailored tuxedos, women in gowns that could pay for entire apartments. Cameras flashed, journalists whispered, waiters glided through with trays of champagne. Alexander offered his arm. Clara looped hers through, steadying herself. The world turned as the first cameras clicked, flashes blinding her for a moment. Smile, Alexander murmured, his lips near her ear. But not too wide. She obeyed. The evening was a gauntlet of introductions. Names blurred, handshakes piled one after another. Clara smiled, nodded, exchanged pleasantries. More than once she stumbled, but Alexander's steady presence guided her, his hand warm at the small of her back, steering her through the crowd. Then came the question. A reporter stepped forward, microphone raised. Mrs. Hayes, what's the secret to your whirlwind romance? It seems like just yesterday, Alexander was the city's most eligible bachelor. Clara froze, her mind scrambling. The story Alexander had fed her echoed dimly. Charity event, conversation, connection. But the words tangled on her tongue. Before panic could choke her, Alexander slipped in smoothly. It was love at first sight, he said, his voice calm, commanding. He looked down at her then, his eyes holding hers with a conviction she hadn't expected. Sometimes you just know. The cameras flashed wildly. Clara forced a small smile, her cheeks burning not from shame, but from the way his gaze had lingered, steady, unwavering, as if for a moment he meant it. Later, when the crowd thinned and the music softened, Clara stepped out onto the balcony for air. The night stretched vast above the city, the hum of traffic rising from below. She gripped the railing, letting the cool wind brush her skin. Escaping? Alexander's voice came behind her. She didn't turn, trying to breathe. He moved beside her, hands resting on the railing, his suit catching the glow of city lights. For a long moment, they stood in silence, watching the endless grid of windows flicker across the skyline. You did well tonight, he said finally. Clara laughed softly, bitterly. I almost choked on the first question. But you didn't. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. And you didn't let Charlotte rattle you last night either. You think you're weak, Clara. You're not. The words struck deeper than she expected. She turned toward him, her voice low. Do you always talk to your fake wife like this? His eyes flicked to hers, unreadable. Do you always take everything so literally? Silence again, heavy, but not uncomfortable this time. She broke it first. Why do you hate this world so much if you have everything? He looked back at the city, his jaw tightening. Because it's never enough. No matter how much money you make, no matter how much power you hold, it's never enough for people like my family. You give them everything, and they only ask for more. Her chest ached at the rawness in his voice. For once, the mask was slipping. And you? He asked suddenly, turning to her. Why do you fight so hard for a life that only takes from you? She blinked, caught off guard. Because I promised my brother I wouldn't let him down. Because when you love someone, you don't walk away. even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. His gaze held hers, steady, piercing. For a moment, the city fell away, and it was just the two of them on that balcony. Two people bound not by wealth or duty, but by scars and promises. Then he looked away, the mask sliding back into place. "We should go. People will talk if we vanish too long." Clara nodded, but her heart was still pounding as they stepped back inside. From across the room, Charlotte watched them return, her eyes narrowing. She saw the shift, however slight, the way Alexander's hand lingered near Clara's. The way Clara's shoulders seemed less tense beside him. Something dangerous was forming between them. Something that threatened the control Charlotte had always craved. She sipped her champagne, her smile sharp as glass. "If he won't see the truth, I'll show it to him," she murmured. Her plan was no longer just suspicion, it was war. That night, back at the mansion, Clara sat at her vanity, unpinning her hair. The jewels lay in a heap beside the mirror, but her reflection didn't look like a stranger anymore. She still saw the nurse beneath, the sister fighting for her brother. Yet now there was something else too, a warmth in her cheeks, a question in her eyes. What if this contract was no longer just survival? And what if that terrified her more than anything else? The morning after the gala dawned gray, heavy clouds rolling in over the city. Clara woke to the sound of rain pattering against the tall windows of her room. She sat up slowly, the silk sheets pooling around her, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe, to imagine that last night had been something other than performance. But the knock on the door shattered the fragile peace. A maid entered, her face pale. "Mrs. Hayes, you should come downstairs, right away." Clara's stomach tightened. She hurriedly pulled on a robe and followed, her slippers whispering against the marble floor. Voices echoed through the grand hall before she even reached it. Sharp, cutting voices. She rounded the corner and froze. Alexander stood in the center of the room, jaw locked, eyes flashing like steel. Across from him, Charlotte lounged with predatory ease, a newspaper spread out in her hands. Around them, relatives murmured in scandalized tones. Charlotte lifted the paper, her lips curling. "Front page, Alexander. Congratulations. You and your wife have made quite the spectacle." She tossed it onto the coffee table. The headline screamed in bold black letters. "Billionaire Hayes, Mary's nurse in secret contract, sources claim it's all for inheritance." Beneath it, grainy photos. Clara entering the boutique days ago, her face caught mid-step. Alexander's car outside her shabby apartment building. Clara in scrubs, exhausted and pale, stepping out of the hospital. The room spun, Clara's throat closed. She couldn't breathe. Alexander snatched the paper, scanning it, his hands tightening on the edges until the page crumpled. "Who leaked this?" Charlotte's eyes glittered. "Oh, come now. Don't look so surprised. Did you think you could bring in a stranger, a nobody, and we wouldn't notice? The world sees it too. A nurse plucked off the street. Do you really expect anyone to believe this is love?" Clara's cheeks burned as whispers rippled through the room. Gold digger, desperate, fraud. She wanted to shout, to defend herself, but the words lodged like stones in her throat. Alexander's voice cut through the noise. Cold, commanding. "Get out." Charlotte blinked, feigning innocence. "Excuse me?" "I said get out," he repeated, his jaw tight. "This house, this family, doesn't need poison like yours." Gasps erupted. Charlotte's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. She stood gracefully, adjusting her crimson jacket. "You can throw me out, cousin, but the story is already out there. You can't silence the truth." Her heels clicked sharply against the marble as she swept out, her laughter echoing behind her. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Clara stood frozen, every eye in the room burning into her. She could feel their judgment, their contempt, pressing down until she could barely breathe. Then Alexander turned, his eyes like fire. "You." Clara flinched. "May? You swore confidentiality. You swore you wouldn't say a word. And now the press knows everything." His voice cracked like thunder. Her mouth opened, desperate. "I didn't, Alexander. I would never—" But he cut her off, his face hard. "Then how do they have photos of you outside your building? Of you in scrubs? Who else would know?" Tears stung her eyes, hot and furious. "You think I would sell myself out?" That I'd put Tommy, my brother, at risk just to talk to a reporter? His silence was worse than accusation. She stepped back, her chest heaving. You don't trust me. You never did. The words hung between them like a knife. Without another word, Clara turned and fled up the staircase, her footsteps echoing through the cavernous halls. She collapsed onto her bed, clutching the sheets. Rage and shame tangled inside her until she could barely tell them apart. She thought of Tommy, of the promises she had made. She thought of Alexander's eyes, cold, accusing, as if she were nothing but a liar. The door burst open. Alexander strode in, his face still stormy. Why? He demanded. Why risk everything? Clara shot to her feet, trembling. Because I didn't. I didn't talk to anyone. I didn't leak anything. I don't even know how they found me. Maybe your world isn't as untouchable as you think. His jaw flexed, but doubt flickered in his eyes. Do you think I enjoy this? She cried. Do you think I like being paraded around like some charity project? Every time I walk into a room, they laugh at me, Alexander. They laugh at you too, for choosing me. Do you think I would make it worse on purpose? He stared at her, his breath sharp. Then who? I don't know, she shouted. But if you can't see I'm telling the truth, then maybe you're not the man I thought you were. The words silenced him. For the first time, his mask slipped uncertainty, even guilt, flashing across his features. But Clara didn't wait. She pushed past him, tears streaking her face, and fled down the hall. Alexander stood alone in the room, fists clenched at his sides. His mind spun. Clara's voice echoed in his ears, raw and furious, more honest than anything he had heard in years. And it rattled him, because beneath the anger, he believed her. Elsewhere in the city, Charlotte reclined in her penthouse suite, a glass of champagne in hand. The tabloid lay open beside her, her phone buzzing with new messages from reporters hungry for more. She smiled, satisfied. Let Alexander rage. Let Clara cry. This was only the beginning. That night, Clara sat by the window of her room, knees pulled to her chest, staring out at the rain streaking the glass. She thought of Tommy, of the bills still waiting, of the promise she had made. She thought of Alexander, of the fire in his voice, of the hurt in his eyes. She whispered into the dark, her voice breaking, I can't do this. But she knew she had to. 6 months. Just 6 months. Yet for the first time, she wondered if 6 months would break her completely. Meanwhile, in his study, Alexander poured himself a glass of whiskey. He stared at the contract, locked in his drawer, the rules, the signatures, the promises, and for the first time, he wondered if rules could hold back the truth. Because despite everything, despite his doubt and his pride, one thought haunted him. What if she's the only one who's been honest all along? The days that followed were heavy with silence. Clara kept to her room, slipping out only when necessary, avoiding Alexander in the endless hallways of the mansion. The staff whispered as she passed, their glances laced with pity or suspicion. Every headline screamed betrayal, every photo painted her as a schemer, and the weight of it pressed against her until she could barely breathe. At night, she stared at her phone, thumb hovering over Tommy's number. She wanted to hear his voice, wanted to confess how badly things had gone. But what could she say? That she had become the punchline of a billionaire's scandal? That her so-called husband looked at her like a stranger he regretted ever meeting? She locked the phone and cried quietly into her pillow instead. Alexander buried himself in work. Board meetings, calls with lawyers, crisis management with PR firms. He wore his armor of suits and sharp words. But inside, her voice still echoed. You don't trust me. You never did. He pored over the leaked photos, hunting for answers. Clara at the boutique, Clara at her apartment, Clara leaving the hospital after a shift. They were too precise, too deliberate. Someone had followed her, which meant someone had set her up. Still, when he closed his eyes, all he could see was her face that night, angry, hurt. Shimmering with tears she tried to hide. On the third evening, his grandfather summoned them both to the study. Clara walked in first, her shoulders tense, her eyes swollen from lack of sleep. Alexander entered moments later, expression cold, though the sight of her made something flicker behind his gaze. The old man sat in his armchair, cane resting against his knee. His voice, though weakened by illness, cut through the room. Enough. Neither spoke. I am old, not blind, he continued. You two walk around this house like enemies bound by chains. Is that what you call marriage? Clara's throat tightened. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. Alexander stepped forward. Grandfather, this situation is more complicated than— No, the old man interrupted sharply. It's not complicated. It's simple. You don't trust her. She doesn't trust you. And without trust, you have nothing. The silence that followed was brutal. Clara lowered her gaze to the floor, heat rising in her chest. The old man tapped his cane. I've changed the terms of my will. The fortune will not go to the cleverest or the most ruthless. It will go to the one who proves he understands what love truly means. His eyes bored into Alexander's. I don't care about appearances. I care about truth. Alexander's jaw tightened, but something in his expression cracked. The old man leaned back, weary but resolute. You think you're testing me with this charade, Alexander, but I am testing you, and I already know the answer is not written in contracts. Clara's breath caught. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt seen. Alexander stood frozen, his mask slipping entirely. The realization hit him like a blow. His grandfather had known all along. And maybe, just maybe, Clara had been the only honest one in this house of lies. The grandfather's words lingered in the air long after Clara left the study. Alexander remained behind, silent, staring at the dying patriarch, who had just dismantled the armor he'd worn his entire life. Love isn't a contract, the old man said again, softer now. You can't buy it, you can't script it. You either live it or you lose everything. For once, Alexander had no reply. The next morning, Clara prepared to leave. She packed what little she had brought, her old scrubs folded neatly beside her borrowed gowns. She couldn't stay here, not with eyes on her every move, not with Alexander's silence cutting deeper than Charlotte's insults ever could. Her phone buzzed. A notification. Her heart sank another headline. But when she tapped it, her breath caught. Alexander Hayes defends wife in surprise speech. She saved me long before I saved her. Her thumb trembled as she opened the article. The night before, at a charity art gala crowded with press, Alexander had taken the microphone. Cameras flashed as he looked over the glittering crowd, his jaw firm, his voice steady. There's been talk, he began. Accusations, lies. The room hushed. Yes, he continued. My wife was a nurse. She's still island. She worked harder than most of us will ever know, saving lives for a paycheck that wouldn't even cover a dinner here tonight. His gaze swept the room, sharp as steel. And I chose her, not for appearances, not for inheritance, because she stood in front of people who mocked her and spoke the truth. Gasps rippled. Charlotte, standing near the back, went pale. Alexander pressed on. If anyone here thinks that makes her less, then you've forgotten what worth really means. Clara Evans Hayes is the bravest woman I know, and if you want to question her place at my side, you'll answer to me. The crowd erupted, some with applause, some with whispers, but the cameras caught it all. Clara lowered the phone, her chest tight. He had defended her, publicly, fiercely, without hesitation. A knock at the door startled her. Alexander stood there, no suit jacket this time, no armor, just a man looking almost uncertain. You saw it, he said quietly. She nodded, her voice trembling. Why? His eyes held hers. Because I was wrong. About everything. About you. About what matters. He stepped closer, the weight of his words pulling the air tighter between them. I thought I needed a wife to satisfy my grandfather. I didn't realize I needed you. Her throat caught. Alexander. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box, not the cold symbol of a contract, but something warmer, older. Inside, the Hayes family ring gleamed, the one his grandfather had once promised would only be given in love, not business. He took her hand, pressing the box into it. No contracts, no conditions, just the truth. Stay with me. Tears blurred her vision. For so long she had braced herself against his arrogance, his suspicion. And now, here he was, stripped bare, offering something real. Clara's fingers closed around the ring. Her voice shook, but her answer was clear. Yes. From the study window above, the old man watched them. His lips curved into the faintest smile. The test was nearly complete, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. The days that followed were different. For the first time since she stepped into the Hayes mansion, Clara no longer felt like an intruder walking on borrowed ground. The staff greeted her with something warmer than politeness. The headlines softened, shifting from scandal to admiration. And Alexander, he no longer moved around her like she was a temporary fixture in his life. He looked at her as if she was the anchor he had been searching for without knowing it. But not everyone celebrated. Charlotte's fury simmered. Her attempt to destroy Clara had backfired spectacularly. The press now painted Alexander as the protective husband, Clara as the dignified underdog, who stood tall despite cruelty. Charlotte's name had vanished from the spotlight, and that, to her, was unforgivable. She stormed into the study one afternoon, clutching a new folder of supposed evidence. This farce will not last. The board will not tolerate. She froze. The patriarch of the family sat in his chair, cane across his lap, Alexander beside him, calm and resolute. Clara stood near the window, sunlight softening her features, the Hayes ring now resting openly on her finger. The old man's voice was quiet but razor-sharp. "Charlotte, you've meddled long enough. I rewrote my will. Your name is gone from it." Her face drained of color. You wouldn't." "I would," he said, steel beneath the frailty of age. "A legacy is not preserved by greed, but by love. Alexander has proven himself. You have proven only spite." Charlotte's lips trembled, but no words came. The silence that followed was final. She turned on her heel and fled, her heels striking sharp echoes that faded into nothing. Weeks later, the mansion's gardens bloomed with early summer roses. White chairs lined the path, lanterns swung gently in the breeze, and the estate, so often a fortress of cold wealth, felt alive, human, almost warm. It was not the grand spectacle society expected from the Hayes heir. There were no flashing cameras, no endless rows of elite guests. Instead, the ceremony was intimate, filled with those who mattered: trusted friends, loyal staff, a few family members who had stood by silently through the storm. Clara walked down the aisle in a simple gown, lace brushing her arms, her hair loose around her shoulders. She carried no jewels, no extravagance. Only a small bouquet of lilies, her mother's favorite flower. Alexander waited at the altar, his expression uncharacteristically soft, his hands steady, though his heart thundered. When their eyes met, the noise of the world fell away. The officiant's words blurred into background music, a rhythm to the vows that mattered more. Alexander took her hands, his voice low but carrying. "I once thought love was a distraction, a weakness. But then you came, Clara. You showed me that love is strength, that it's not about contracts or conditions, it's about choosing someone, every day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Clara's eyes shimmered as she spoke. "I came into this house as a stranger, carrying nothing but fear and hope. I thought I was here to save my brother. I didn't know I would find someone who needed saving too. You taught me that even the coldest walls can break, and behind them is a heart worth loving." There was no hesitation when the ring slipped onto her finger. This time, it wasn't a deal. It wasn't an arrangement. It was a promise. "By the power vested in me," the officiant declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Oh! Applause rose, gentle but joyful. Alexander drew her close, his kiss tender and real, sealing the vow not with obligation but with devotion. The grandfather watched from his chair at the front, his frail hands clasped over his cane. A tear slid down his weathered cheek, though his smile was bright. He leaned toward the butler at his side. "Now this is what I wanted to see before the end." Later, during the small reception, he raised a glass. His voice was weak, but carried with surprising clarity. "To love that is not bought, not faked, but lived. To my grandson, who finally understands, and to the woman who gave him that gift." The guests lifted their glasses high. Clara blinked away tears, Alexander's arms steady around her waist. As dusk fell, lanterns glowed across the garden, their soft light spilling over roses and laughter. Clara leaned into Alexander's shoulder, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She remembered the night she first signed her name on that cold, lifeless contract, her hand trembling with fear. Now, she looked at her wedding band gleaming in the lantern light, warm and solid, a symbol not of survival but of choice. Alexander pressed a kiss to her temple. His whisper meant only for her. No more contracts, no more rules. Just us. She smiled, her voice steady. Just us. The storm that had brought them together was long gone. What remained was the life they would build, not of lies, not of wealth, but of truth. And in the quiet heart of the Hayes estate, love, not legacy, not power, finally reigned.